is going to be recorded. Right? There we go. And so I think I have to hit something here. Say okay, and make sure that you're all on mute. Okay, good. Now, Murray Angus is a local historian and passionate advocate for preserving Brantford's rich history, and has dedicated much of his life to uncovering and sharing the stories of his hometown. Murray developed a fascination with the city's past, I should say, during his teenage years spent downtown. His father's jewelry store was located on an old building on King Street, provided a unique opportunity for him to connect with Brantford's historical roots. Murray's passion for history extends beyond personal anecdotes. He actively contributes to preserving Brantford's heritage through various projects and initiatives, notably as a member of the Brantford Historical Society. Murray's dedication to sharing Brantford's history ensures that its stories continue to resonate with both locals and visitors alike. Murray, please take it away.
Thanks very much, David. It's wonderful to see everyone here. I'm going to just get onto share my screen here so that we can, I'll show you what we're doing. All right. Now, okay. Here we go. Here are a few examples of Brantford's history. When I first took this project on, hang on, I gotta check. Okay, there we are. When I first took this project on, it was at the request of Brian Moore at the museum, and said, would you do a presentation on something? What would you like to do it on? I said, well, I used to know a lot of the businesses downtown. So I said, let me do something on family-owned businesses. And then I thought, I started researching a little bit, and I thought, oh, what have I opened a can of worms here with every business is family owned. If you go back 100 years, every business was family owned. And I thought, well, if I want to make a presentation, I better whittle it down a tiny bit to maybe some multi-generational. So I thought if I do two generations, and I got thinking, and there was so many, and I got thinking, okay, I'm going to go to three. There had to be three generations of businesses, and that sort of gave me a start. And again, these are just a few of the ones that I researched. And I'm going to tell you a story. So once upon a time, there were three brothers, Sam, Ted, and George. And they, of course, were the Stedman brothers. And back in 1890, 9-year-old Sam Stedman started selling newspapers on the street, and within a few years convinced his younger brothers, Edward and George, to join him. And they turned these humble beginnings into a multi-million-dollar business that encompassed 350 stores in small towns and big cities from coast to coast. Now, I don't know that people in Brantford really understood how big Stedman's was, because we had the Stedman's bookstore here, and I don't think a lot of people, and they knew it was locally owned, but I think a lot of people didn't really get the depth of this company. And back then there were two local papers that were the main source of news in the city, and they were bitter enemies, these people. They were quite the big rival. Oh, hold on here. Where are we going? There was the Expositor, which supported the liberal causes in town, rough-looking bunched. And the Courier, which was the opposing paper, which was pretty much promoted the conservative causes for when they reported the news. And for some reason, my thing isn't working. There we go. But as fate would have it, shortly after they started selling papers, there was a sensational murder trial in Woodstock. The Stedman boys decided that people's need for the paper was going to get more and more as the trial went on, and they capitalized on this public desire for newspapers, and soon they were looking to set themselves apart from everyone else. Now, this murder trial in Woodstock was quite a big thing because it was two English aristocratic people. One was a con man selling property that he didn't own, and he ended up murdering the young man who came to look at the property, and then he pretended to be him, and he sent email or telegrams to the man's father telling him to quickly send the money. We have to buy this property. Anyway, he got caught and he was executed. He was hanged in Woodstock, and the desire for papers went crazy. So the Stedman boys were selling papers like nobody else. And then they decided they needed to set themselves apart from everyone else. They thought, I need to sell national newspapers. No one else in Brantford was selling national newspapers on the day that they were printed. They were always a couple of days old or 3 days old by the time they'd get them. There was the Globe, the Mail, and the World newspapers. And so Sam contacted these three newspapers and said, I want to be the distributor for these papers outside of your local area there. So they gave him distribution from Brantford all the way south all the way to through to Woodstock and Port Dover and all down there, that part of the province. So Sam said, okay, put the papers, I'll pick them up on the train in the morning, put them on the earliest train I can get them. And they said, well, there's no train that stops in Brantford in the morning. So they said the closest place you can get papers is in Harrisburg. That's the early morning train stops in Harrisburg at 6 a.m. So Sam, as a young man, teenager, would go and rent a wagon and a horse every morning. And at 20 after 4, he knew he had to leave at 20 after 4 in the morning. He would take his horse and carriage down to his wagon, down to all the way to Harrisburg, which is the other side of St. George, meet the train, collect all the newspapers, and bring them back to Brantford to sell them. And he did that every day, and people went crazy for the papers because they were getting the Globe and Mail, or the Globe, the Mail, or the World paper on the day it was printed. Well, then they decided they needed a place to put all these papers. So they rented a room over a butcher shop on Colburn Street somewhere, and they kept loading their papers in and out of this rented room. And eventually they noticed that there was a stationery store down the street that was going out of business. So they bought this storefront and rented the building. And a few years later, they bought out the stationery business that was there at 160 Colburn Street, and the first Stedman retail location was born. So this is a picture, actually, of the Stedman store at 160 Colburn Street. And you can see they sold, it was mostly stationery and all kinds of product that they sold. It wasn't necessarily a bookstore at that point. But I love the tin ceiling and the chandelier there. It's amazing. Here's an interesting little thing from, it's a receipt for a Mr. Foster from the courthouse who bought received payment of $1. He paid Stedman's for 3 months subscription to the Globe newspaper. So for $1 in 1912, that was. But going back just a wee bit, by 1905, they started manufacturing stationery, and they soon expanded, making into postcards, souvenir books, Christmas cards. And the company was first located here above the Hex Carriage Works on Dalhousie Street. Now, some of you have been in that building and you don't even know it, but I'll tell you about it in a minute, a little bit more. They were on, I think, the 3rd floor, and they were buying stationery, and they thought, we might as well just start making our own. We can do it cheaper, and they started printing again. postcards, souvenir books, and Christmas cards. And by 1915, they had bought the old former Collegiate Institute building on George Street and became their headquarters. Now, this particular location, this building was torn down, but this location is on George Street, right next to Central School. It's now a park, that particular building, but it became their headquarters, and they then combined their two businesses of wholesale and retail. And what they were doing was they had started franchising businesses across the country and were supplying their own stores, their franchise stores, with product. They soon had hundreds of locations from coast to coast, but they moved their head office to Toronto from here in 1924. Now, Sam spent a lot of time in Brantford as chairman of the board, and his brother George being the president. But Sam said, we only moved the business, had nothing to do with Brantford being good or bad. He said, we wanted to move just because of the availability and the convenience of having the head office in Toronto. But Sam did stay in Brantford for a long time, and he traveled back and forth. They stayed here for 30 years, and then they stayed here. Right here, you can see on the right-hand side of the building, of the picture, Stedman's store, and you can see it's postcards, and that's their building at 160 Colburn that they moved into, that I showed you the earlier picture of. And then they moved 3 stores to the left, to 154. And you can see right about the middle where it says Bowles, Bowles, that store, the store next door to that with the 4 windows and the 2 dormers on the top. That's the store that we remember. That's 154 Colburn. That's the store that most of us relate to being the Stedman store that we remember. But in 1913, just before the brothers combined their manufacturing business with their retail business, Sam married Jessie Cockshut Kippack. And Jessie Cockshut her mother was a Cockshut. Her mother was the daughter of Ignatius Cockshut. And so Jessie was one of those people who could actually call Ignatius grandpa, I think, So I don't know if Sam ever called him grandpa or whether he would probably refer to him as Mr. Cockshut, I'm sure. But he married Jessie Cockshut Kippack, and they continued making their business grow. But their pastel postcards were at first made for them in Germany, and they quickly became a huge seller in every store. And they didn't just sell postcards from Brantford. In the Brantford store, they had Brantford postcards of landmarks and things, but they had pictures and photos taken of every landmark around the country, and particularly in the cities where they had stores. And they would load up these stores with postcards of the local landmarks, and it became huge, and it's become a gigantic collector's thing now, is the old Stedman brothers postcards. And you can see on the cover of this book 6,500 cards, different cards they printed, the postcard it swept the country like crazy as soon as they were soon selling 400,000 postcards a year. Now that's not just Brantford, of course, that's all across the country, but 400,000 postcards a year that they were doing. Here's just a few examples. This is some from Brantford, the Grand Trunk Railroad, of course, our train station. This is Colburn Street, looking east from about King Street, looking back towards, looking down towards what's now the library and whatnot. There's an old postcard of our public library, the Carnegie Library, now part of Laurier. And here they are, and when people used to swim and boat and relax at Mohawk Lake in Mohawk Park. They also did one, here's the entrance to Stanley Park. in Vancouver because they had stores out there. City Hall in Toronto, the old City Hall. But they had them for every city that they had stores in. And in 1962, the business was sold to Gamble Stockmo of Minneapolis, and they kept the stores running for a little bit. But by 1988, Brantford's Stedman bookstore was closed. And this is the store I think most of us remember for sure. But Sam, as well as the chairman of Stedman, Sam also served as an alderman for the city of Brantford for 3 years. He was, for a time, was the president of Brantford Oven and Rack Company. Also served as vice president of Slingsby Manufacturing. Brantford Oven and Rack and Slingsby's were both at the time owned by the Cockshut family. And he passed away in 1965 at the age of 84. And his daughters, Mary, Ruth, and Margaret, followed in their father's footsteps, and Mary worked for McClellan Stewart in Toronto for a number of years and returned to Brantford to manage the Brantford store from 1950 to 1974. A lot of you may remember bumping into Mary in the store. I remember as a kid going in and knowing that she was the lady in charge. I remember that. She was also a director of the Samuel Stedman Foundation, which she founded shortly after her father's passing. Mary passed away in 2014 at the age of 92, but she made sure the Samuel Stedman Foundation would keep going. And the sisters each donated $250,000 for a total of $750,000, gave it to Laurier in order for Laurier to open a bookstore. Now, when it started, it was a community bookstore. It's still a community bookstore, but it's pretty much 95% Laurier product, which is that's what they sell, that's what they carry. But that bookstore is in Brantford because of Mary and her sisters, Margaret and Ruth. There is the old streetscape when it was, and that's the exact same section of street today. And I kind of like the old one myself, but nonetheless, there it is. Moving on to the Brantford Plow Works. None of us remember it as the Brantford Plow Works, but we remember it as, of course, the Cockshut Company. And this is when they started. James Cockshut began the Brantford Plow Works in 1877 in a small plant on the canal at South Market Street. And he started with 5 employees. Now that is James Cockshut, the oldest son of Ignatius. And I put Ignatius's picture in here because in order for me to squeak through 3 generations, I needed to get Ignatius in there. And he was the vice president for a while. But it's an interesting story. This is a picture of their store. Here you can see where, if I go back one, you can see the original building with the shaped roof there, the pointed roof. And if I go to here, you can see where the roof has been changed and they've added an addition to the left-hand side of that picture. But the name was changed from the Brantford Plow Works to the Cockshut Plow Company when it was incorporated in 1882. And this is a picture from the late 80s. And you can see they have more employees, of course. But one model that they had was the JGC riding lawnmower, the James Cockshut, of course, riding plow, not lawnmower. It was so popular, it became known as the plow that opened the West. And unfortunately, James died in 1885 from tuberculosis a few months before this patent was registered. But this was a real game changer for the people on the prairies because the shape and the quality of the blade allowed them to plow the prairies, and it worked, and it sold so many units. It's what made the company. But you can see there's the building, the original building, just to the left of center, the old bridge that went across the canal before we built the Victoria Bridge. But you can see the original building that the pictures were taken in front of there, just to the left, and And they kept expanding out the back. They became so busy. The capacity was increased over the years. The factory expanded many times. With sections of the building were torn down and rebuilt. Additions were made. And that rebuilding process lasted from 1880 to 1898. And then by 1903, the company had outgrown this particular site and again expanded, but this time they moved down to Mohawk Road, which we know as Mohawk Street today. The Coxsett Plow Company became one of the largest agricultural implement producers in the world, and the company remained under the family's control until the 1960s, till it was purchased by American interests and renamed White Farm Equipment. But this was the original building, and you can see there's still a couple of those little pieces of that building on the left-hand side of that picture are still down there. They're trying to build a museum around those, but here are the presidents, and I'll show to you why it took me a little bit of work to get 3 generations of Coxsetts in here, because James was the president from 1877 to 1885, and then when he passed away, his brother W.F. Coxsett returned from England to take over the business. He was there buying product, and he would back and forth to England because he was running his father's old store on Coburn Street, now where the library is. But he took over as president for 3 years, and then his younger brother Frank Coxsett took over when WF decided he needed to get back to his own businesses. Frank took over and he ran the company for just over 20 years. And then the youngest brother, Harry, took over when Frank left the business, and Harry ran it from 1911. He ran it for 10 years. Then he took a year off because he was appointed the lieutenant governor of Ontario, and he needed a year to get, he was going to take the whole time off, 3 or 4 years, but they appointed a man by the name of George Wedlake to become president, who had been the vice president. And Harry, then George Wedlake died of a heart attack within a year. He was the mayor of the city and died in office in 1922. And so Harry stepped back in and became the president again, carried on both jobs, his job as lieutenant governor and as the president of the company. But again, we're still on the same generation of people. This is James's youngest brother. And then finally, the second generation, Gordon Coxsett, who some of you may have met over the years. Gordon was he was Frank's son, and Gordon ran the company for 26 years. And he's the one who shepherded the whole company through the Second World War and all the war manufacturing that they did during the war, the airplanes and castings of grenades and all kinds of things that they did. And when the company was finally sold. But again, this is our second generation. And from 1880 to 1960, it was one generation of family, and sorry, 2 generations. But again, like I said, Ignatius did run the company. He was a vice president for a while, so we got the 3rd generation in there. But Gordon ran it till 1960. And here's the president. This is, you can see the second from the right. That's George Wedlake. He only did run the company for about a year and then died of a heart attack, like I was saying. But there are the brothers. Those are all 5 of the four brothers, and Gordon. Moving on to the George Watt and Sons. This is probably a company that most of you haven't heard of. They were they became a gigantic wholesaling company of fruits, vegetables, products, tea, oil, whatever, food. And this is on the corner of King Street and Dalhousie. So the photographer today, if you were taking that picture, that would show you the parking lot on the corner. To the right of this picture, out of the picture, would be the Kentucky Fried Chicken on the other side of King Street. And my back for this photo would be towards OK Tire. So I'd be facing away from OK Tire, just to give you a perspective of where that is. Well, George Watt, born in Ireland, 1924, and in 1824, and in 1845 emigrated to Canada with his son, his wife, and they moved to Montreal for a couple of years, and in Brockville for a few years, had two more sons, moved to Brantford, started building houses when he came here. He'd been a ship worker on the ship coming over. He'd been building, helping repair the ship and everything. He had lots of experience with woodworking. He began building houses once he arrived here, and in 1854, he opened a grocery store, and they had a fourth son. Now, his first store was on the corner of Colburn and Market, which is on the Market Street property, which is, we kind of remember that where a French fry stand used to be always. But it was on the Market Square, and you could only lease the lots. You couldn't buy them. They were trying to raise money. The city was trying to raise money to build our first city hall, our town hall on the Market Square. And they were leasing lots. And you could lease a lot for $60 a year on Colburn Street, or if you wanted to face Dalhousie Street, you got it for $30 a year for your lot. And then the store was on their main floor, and they lived above it, and the fifth son was born. Excuse me, and the original store ended up burning down, and the business changed locations several times. And eventually they ended up on Dalhousie Street between King and Queen, and became more of a wholesale distributor than a retail grocer. And in 1876, George bought the empty lot and built this property, a huge warehouse. Now, that building was torn down to build the parking lot, to allow the parking lot. It was a pretty rough building. I do remember being there as a kid, because if you look on the very right-hand side of this picture, you'll see a little piece of a building with a roof on it. That is actually what became Angus Jewelers years later. That little tiny building, little store you can hardly see, but that's where the parking lot is now. James Watt was George's second oldest son, and he became the president in 1910 of their wholesale company. And Thomas, the oldest, served most of his life as the company's secretary treasurer, but he was never the president. But he was the secretary treasurer, his oldest son. So this is his second born son. And then another son, George, served as vice president to his brother James, and he became president after James stepped down as president, but stayed with the company. And George ran the company for about 10 years. And then Charles was the son of Thomas, and he was the third generation to become the president. And he ran it for 14 or 15, 16 years. And then William was Thomas's grandson and the fourth generation of the family to provide over the company. And William Watt was the president up until 1960 when they closed. But I was just going to tell you a little bit about George. This guy was quite fascinating, and we don't really know much about him. We don't hear much about him. We hear about the Coxets and all the other people in town, but we don't hear about George Watt very often. And he and two other businessmen just wanted to build a church, so they paid the money and they built Zion Presbyterian, which is now St. Andrews. They just paid to have it built. And then George served as a city councilor for a year or 2 years. And in 1878, Watt and Sons was the largest tea importer in this part of Canada, as well as becoming the largest wholesale supplier of sugar, with George many times writing checks in excess of $100,000, sometimes twice a month. He was buying $100,000 worth of sugar for a single order, and sometimes he was doing that twice a month. In October of 1886, Ontario Almanac, George Watt and Sons was listed as having a credit rating of $50,000 and being an excellent risk. And in that very same issue, Timothy Eaton was listed as having a $10,000 credit rating, and he was a fair risk. So George Watt was, at the time, bigger than Timothy Eaton. It's hard to imagine the amount of money that these people handled and what they did and how much they sold. It was a continuous lineup of wagons going through that warehouse, going in off the Lucy Street, going through the building, being loaded up, being taken out onto the alleyway and then out onto King Street. They couldn't have them two-way on the going in and out on Dalhousie. It would cause too much traffic jam. Oh well, horse jam. And then but they would take these wagons through, and they carried everything from, they carried barrels of pickles, and they carried pork and vinegar and oils and, like I say, sugar and tea and coffee and barrels and barrels. The weight of the products that they brought in, they had so much inventory that the floors of that warehouse were built with railroad ties. That's like big 8x8 railroad ties were the size of the flooring on the different levels of that building because of the weight, and just unbelievable amount of product. And when George was elected mayor in 1894, he donated his salary back to the city. He felt that the city needed it more than he did. And in 1907, the city again found itself in financial trouble, and George lent them $70,000. Just wrote them a check because they were short, and they did repay him the following year. And George worked right up until the time of his death in the business until 1910. So he was the president in 1854, and he kept working in the company for another 60 years after that. And he died at age 86. But amazing story about a family of this incredible amount of product. Their company came to an end because people, by 1960, grocery stores were opening their own locations. Loblaws was opening up Dominion stores, the red and white stores. They were coming to town, and they were supplying themselves with products. So it just was a sign of the times. Their business became a little bit irrelevant. Moving on to the Digby family, 4 generations of Digby doctors. We had Alfred Digby, born in Ireland in 1806, came to Brantford in 1835. And then his son, James, took over his practice in 1842. James Digby was the mayor of Brantford he was the mayor of the town of Brantford. He was the last mayor while we were a town. And he became the first mayor when we became a city in 1877. So that's his son, James. And then James's son, Reg, who was the son of James Digby, spent his entire 55-year career as a physician in Brantford. And James Digby, who was Reg's son, took over the tradition of his great-grandfather, Alfred. So a lot of people, you all knew Jim Digby, a lot of you, I'm sure, knew Jim. But the Digby house was on the corner of Wellington Street and Market Street. And this is where the Bell Telephone office is now. But this house faced onto Wellington, not onto Market Street like the thing. So this was a house where anybody who was anybody that came to town went to meet the mayor or the doctors who were also the mayor at the time. A lot of people, a lot of important meetings, a lot of gatherings were held here. And I will tell you, this particular house was served as the office for the first 3 generations of Digby doctors. And it had the first business telephone in Brantford. And the other phone was at a drugstore down the street on Market Street. And he could phone the drugstore, order his prescription for his client, for his patient, Kid would run it down the street and deliver it, and they thought it was pretty amazing. People actually used to go to the house so they could get on his phone, and they would send somebody down to the drugstore just so they could talk to each other on the phone. They thought it was a pretty neat thing to do. So, first business phone. Moving on to another generational family, Ludlows. Ludlow Brothers was started in 1911 by Austin Ludlow, known as Ott, and his brother Charles. There's a picture of Ott. There's their first store. You can see the sign. Take a look. Just remember the shape of that sign. Both men started out working in other businesses. Ott worked for Wiles and Quinlan, and Charles worked in a shoe store. They soon decided to open their own store, with Ott selling men's and boys' clothes, Charles selling shoes. The stores were side by side with a doorway between them, but they were separate businesses. They operated as separate. And the reason I have this picture is not because of the elephants, even though elephants are pretty cool. If you look on the very right-hand side, you can see the clothier sign. Remember the shape of that sign? You can see that's where their store was. And where it says bowling and liquors, that space is now the Sanderson Center. So they tore down a bowling alley and a liquor store to build the Sanderson Center. Can you believe that? But there's a store right next to when it was the Capitol Theater before it became the Sanderson. Here's the store in 1930. They had moved down the street to 92 and 94 Dalhousie, where most of us remember it being from 1930. And that's the front of their store. In 1942, the decision was made to stop selling boys' clothing and men's workwear. And soon after that, Ott retired and his son George took over. There's George Ludlow, the younger man. Ott died shortly after he retired, actually. I think with less than a year and a half later, he died. And George was running the business anyway, so all was good. In 1856, the store doubled in size. They expanded to the right side of this picture. They expanded next door, which had been the home of the Capitol Bakery and the Rosary Flower Shop, but they took over and became two big stores. The shoe store on one side, the clothing on the other. And in 1966, George's son, Don, having been working part-time since the age of 10, started working full-time for his dad. He became the third generation of the Ludlow family to work in the store. Don's son, Greg, who started at age 12 working in the store after schools, he joined the business full-time in 2000, becoming the fourth generation of the family to be involved in the business. And there's the four generations. In 2002, Ludlow's moved out of the downtown and built a new store on Linden Road. But there's the four generations from Ott to George to Don to Greg. Interesting. Moving on, J.H. Young and Son. Known today as J.H. Young and Sons Fine Jewelers. They first began in 1900 with James Young bought Jones Opticians that was located at 86 Culver Street. You can see there it is on the left as Jones's Opticians, and there it is on the right as Young. Same store, same location. Throughout the 1960s, jewelers and optometrists often shared the same store, as many of the tools were the same, and James Young started as a jeweler and optician business. And at the time, J.H. Young's was located at 86 Culver Street, and James and his wife Matilda lived over the store with their four children, Charles, May, Leonard, and Ward. At first of the second generation, Charles entered the business as a jeweler and worked in the store until 1972. Leonard was the next to join the family business, worked till 1978. Ward was the youngest son who joined the business as an optometrist, and they all worked together in Young's with the mother Tilly actually helping out whenever she could. And in 1969, the optometry part of Young's branched out into a separate location, which eventually became Wells Young Zach Optometrist on William Street. Leonard's son Robert followed in his father's footsteps and became the third generation of Young's, and he married Betty, and they had four children, David, Diane, Paul, and Graham. After Robert's passing, Betty owned and operated the business until she died in 2009. And here are the fourth and fifth generations of the Youngs jewelers. You've got Paul, Vanessa, Graham, Diane, David, and Lauren. Now, Paul, Diane, and David are the fourth generation. And Paul's sister Vanessa trained as a jeweler in California and works with her dad, her aunt, and her uncles. And David's daughter Lauren also works in a store in sales. And she and Vanessa are the fifth generation. So that is, without doubt, Brantford's longest running family business. And I believe they are the longest running family jewelry store, definitely in Ontario. I'm pretty sure in all of Canada, with the generational ownership like that. Amazing, right here in Brantford. And that's their store right next to Ludlow's, actually, on Linden Road when they moved out of downtown.
Murray.
Moving on to the Forbes brothers.
Murray.
Yeah.
We're starting to get a little low on time. How much more?
Okay. I'll do Forbes brothers very quick. Do you want, we got 5 minutes?
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Okay. Here we go. I'll give you 5 minutes. Russ and Stan Forbes left their jobs as executives at Ford Motor Company in Detroit, moved to Tilbury, and then they began selling Ford cars and parts. And then they moved to Brantford in 1924 on Colburn Street, which is on the corner of Clarence, which is now just I think it's an auto glass shop now. Then they moved here in 1926 onto Darling Street. And in 1932, they added a service station. And there's an aerial view. You can see that's the big square thing just to the left of center. That's their store. And just to the right of that is the gas station. That's on Darling Street. A lot of us remember Forbes on Darling. Now, here's a group of guys from 1937. This is a company picture. I don't know if you can see, but there's a guy in there. I don't know if you'll be able to pick him out. He's I don't know who he is, but I think he's the complaint department is what I think he is. And I'll show you a close-up of him right there. He's got a gun and it's cocked for some reason. There he is, third one from the left, front row. I don't know who he is exactly, but I figure he's got to be the complaint department. But you can see Stan, there's the two brothers right in the center. And in 1940, Russ left the business and became a dealer in Kitchener, left Stan to Brantford to run the business. And Stan's two sons, Bruce and Tom, took over from their dad, Stan. Here's a company picture from 1951, and you can see there's Stan just to the left, or Bruce to the left of center, and Tom to the right of center. But you can see most of the fellows that worked there were mechanics. You know, look at that. The majority of them, that's what they did, fixed cars back then. And I only brought this picture in because of the big sign that we all remember. 1955, they switched from Ford to General Motors. And that's a big GM sign that they put up. Here's a couple of old ads from the 1960s. Here's an old receipt from my dad. He bought 1966. He bought a Chevy Biscayne for $2,400, brand new. And he got optional equipment of windshield washers, backup lights, a mirror, and seat belts, which is interesting options. They moved down here to 1972. Now the Brantford Convention Center. And Tom retired that very same year they moved. And then Jim and Bob entered the business full time. And here they moved to 19-21 Linden Road. And they didn't have an address for that building on Linden Road. It was a brand new build. So they asked if they could be 19-21 because 1921 was the year that the business was started in Brantford. So interesting little footnote there. And then here they are celebrating 90 years in the family business. And Stan and Russ in 1921 and Jim and Bob in 2011. Interesting family story. That's, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my presentation. Because I do have one more, but it's going to take another 10 minutes, but I'll leave it at that.